Okay, let's dig into the latest forecast for the equipment rental industry.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the source material here. It's an interview with Scott Hazelton from S&P Global Market Intelligence. He's the one who compiles the data for the ARA, the American Rental Association.
Right, and it was published by Rental Management Media Group.
Exactly. So our mission today, let's unpack the key data, try to understand the big economic forces shaping these numbers.
Yeah, and figure out what this specific forecast might tell us about the broader economy, the stuff you're seeing around you.
Okay, so what's the big headline number?
Well, the main thing is a forecast predicting 7.1% growth in equipment rental revenue for 2024.
7.1%. Wow, I mean, given everything, that feels like a really strong number.
It is, yeah. Pretty solid. That kind of growth, it's expected to push the total revenue. We're talking construction, industrial, and general tool combined.
Okay.
To nearly $76.6 billion this year.
76.6 billion. That's up from last year then.
Oh, yeah. Up from about $71.5 billion in 2023. So, another record for the industry.
So a strong outlook for 24. Did this particular quarterly update, did it throw up any big surprises, or was it kind of expected?
According to the source, not really this time. This update was largely steady. Economic growth landed pretty much where they thought it would after, some stronger than expected performance earlier.
All right, so the current numbers are pretty predictable, but I saw the source hints that previous forecasts saw some, pretty significant changes based on new info.
That's right. Yeah, that's where it gets interesting.
What were those big adjustments, the ones that kind of reshaped the history and the outlook?
Okay, so there are two main things that really shifted past forecasts. The first one involved refining the data they use for non-residential construction spending.
Construction spending. Okay, that sounds pretty fundamental. What was the problem there?
Well, for a while, there was this sort of growing feeling that the official Census Bureau data on construction spending might actually be understating what was happening.
Understating?
How so?
The numbers just didn't quite seem to square with other things they were tracking, like construction employment levels. Things weren't matching up.
So the official numbers maybe weren't telling the whole story. How did they fix that?
Well, the Federal Reserve System actually did a deep dive, an analysis of the census methodology itself, and they came up with an estimate for how big that underestimate might be.
Okay.
S&P Global Market Intelligence then took that analysis and used it to adjust the historical non-residential construction spending data that feeds into their forecast model.
Got it. So they didn't change the forecast model itself, the structure. It was the input data, the history it was looking at.
Exactly right. The core model stayed the same. But the inputs, especially for 2021, 2022, and part of 2023, got revised based on this better understanding of the census data's, limitations.
And the effect was?
The effect was basically showing higher growth in those specific past years than they had previously reported. A more accurate baseline. Makes sense. Better data in, better picture out. Okay, and what was the second major change you mentioned?
This one was, arguably even bigger. It relates to something called specialty rental.
Specialty rental? Like, are we expanding what counts as rental equipment here?
Pretty much, yeah. The industry's changed, and things that maybe used to be niche or weren't always included in the main rental numbers have become much more common, much more significant.
Like what kind of things?
The source mentions adding or, giving more weight to items like on-site sanitation units.
Oh, okay. Porta potties and such?
Right, and mobile structures, ground protection mats, load banks, certain pumps, backup power generators, things like that.
Stuff that maybe wasn't always lumped in with, the backhoes and the cement mixers?
Exactly. Some were left out before, some were maybe counted but not fully captured.
Yeah.
And their use in rental has just grown a lot.
Okay, and because these specialty areas have grown faster...
Since these segments have seen, faster growth than the more traditional equipment types, adding them in properly changes the whole historical picture.
Right.
We're talking going back 10 years in the data.
Wow. And if they're growing faster?
Then including them gives a big boost to the overall historical growth rates. And naturally, the forecast growth rate going forward, too.
How big a boost are we talking?
It was substantial. According to the source, it increased the estimated market size for 2023 by nearly $11 billion.
$11 billion, just from redefining.
Yeah. And it increased the overall forecast growth rate by almost 400 basis points. That's, 4 percentage points.
Wow. That's huge. An $11 billion difference and a 4-point swing just from making sure you're counting everything. It really shows how dynamic the industry is.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And how important accurate measurement is. Makes you wonder about other sectors too.
Definitely. Okay, let's focus back on 2024 then. What are the main economic factors the source points to that are driving the 7.1% growth forecast?
Well, interest rates are still a major factor, a really big one.
Even if they don't hike rates again.
Yeah, even then, the impact of the hikes we've already had, it takes time to really filter through the economy, typically maybe 8 to 12 months.
Right, that lag effect.
Exactly. So mortgage rates, for instance, they're still expected to peak sometime in 2024. Corporate bond rates maybe have already topped out.
And at higher rates, they usually slow things down, right? What sectors are feeling it most, and how does that connect back to renting equipment?
The source points right at the interest-sensitive areas. Think home building, non-residential structures construction, and durable goods manufacturing.
Okay.
Now, there are some bright spots, like autos and aircraft production seem strong, but higher borrowing costs are definitely putting the brakes on activity in those other big areas.
Which are big customers for rental equipment.
Precisely. So that slowdown naturally dampens the potential growth for construction and industrial equipment rental. Growth is still expected, but maybe not as high as it could have been otherwise.
That makes total sense. Fewer new buildings, fewer factory expansions, less need for the big rental gear. What about the housing market specifically? That always feels like a bellwether.
Yeah, the outlook for existing home sales, it's still pretty challenged. Transaction volumes are low, mostly because of those higher mortgage rates locking people into the lower rates they already have.
The lock-in effect, yeah.
But interestingly, home renovation spending seems to be holding up pretty well.
Okay, so people are still fixing up their houses, but is it the same kind of renovation we saw a few years ago?
That's a really interesting point the source makes. Traditionally, a lot of renovation spending is tied to people moving. You buy an older house, you immediately redo the kitchen, the bathrooms.
Right, getting it ready to live in or flip.
But with fewer people moving, with people staying put longer because of the market, the focus of renovation shifts.
Shifts how?
It moves more towards, let's say, essential repairs and upgrades. Things that improve the house you're planning to stay in for a while, rather than just cosmetic changes for resale.
Like putting on a new roof or replacing siding, maybe updating the HVAC.
Exactly. Roofing, siding, mechanical systems, those are highlighted. And that shift actually changes the mix of tools people need to rent for these jobs compared to, say, a big kitchen gut.
Huh. So even subtle shifts in why people renovate, driven by interest rates, it trickles all the way down to what tools are in demand.
It's a great example of how those big economic forces play out on the ground.
And what about manufacturing's impact on rental?
Well, tool rental into manufacturing, especially the durable goods side, it's being held back a bit. Production levels there are relatively weak, so you see growth, but it's more limited compared to other parts of the rental market.
Okay. Now, the source uses this term, growth recession, to describe the overall economic outlook. That sounds kind of contradictory. Can you unpack that?
It does sound a bit strange, yeah. So a technical recession, that's usually defined by falling GDP and rising unemployment. The previous outlook for the U.S. economy was leaning more towards maybe a minor technical recession, like real GDP growth dipping just under 1%.
Okay.
The current view they're describing is this growth recession.
So what's the difference then, if GDP is still growing?
Well, a growth recession is typically characterized by slowly rising GDP. So positive growth, but not strong, combined with rising unemployment.
So the economy's growing, but not fast enough to keep unemployment down.
Exactly. And this kind of scenario often feels like a recession to, the average person because the labor market gets less tight, job openings might shrink, hiring slows, maybe wage growth cools off, even though the overall economy isn't technically shrinking.
So it's not like a sharp drop, a V-shape kind of thing.
No, and that's a key point the source makes. Without that sharp downturn, you don't usually get a strong, fast recovery bounce afterwards.
Right.
The description used is slower for longer. The expectation is for real GDP growth to just kind of muddle along at roughly 1% per year.
So performance-wise, maybe not that different from a minor recession number-wise.
Perhaps not hugely significant in terms of the number itself, but the implication is this sustained slow pace, rather than, say, a sharp dip followed by a quick rebound.
Okay, given this slower for longer, maybe bumpy outlook, What's the biggest risk the source sees for this rental industry forecast in 2024?
Inflation. That remains the number one risk factor.
Really? Even though the main forecast assumes it's going to fade.
Precisely. The baseline scenario depends on inflation continuing to cool down. That would mean, lower cost increases for rental companies, equipment costs, things like that, and maybe less power to just pass through rate increases to customers.
And that depends on?
That depends on things like supply chain staying stable and getting better control over wage inflation across the economy.
Okay, so the risk is if inflation doesn't cooperate, if it stays sticky.
Exactly. If inflation turns out to be more persistent than hoped, well, that could force the Fed to hike interest rates further.
Which would put more pressure on the economy.
And could definitely negatively impact the rental industry's outlook. Global unrest is also mentioned, as a potential wild card. Highly volatile, but it's not seen as the primary risk driver for the 24 forecast right now.
Gotcha. The source also mentioned something called the U.S. Rental Penetration Index. What is that exactly? Why track it?
Yeah, the rental penetration index, it's a really key metric for the industry. Basically, it measures the percentage of the total construction equipment fleet out there in the U.S.
Okay.
That's owned by the rental industry itself.
Yeah.
And it's calculated based on the original purchase price of all that equipment.
So it's the rental company's share of all the construction gear versus what construction firms own themselves.
That's it. And the latest figure they cite is 53.8%. But that's for the year 2022. It takes a while to compile.
53.8%. Does that number move around much?
It generally trends upwards, especially in times of, say, economic uncertainty.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. If the future looks shaky, companies might be hesitant to shell out huge amounts of capital for new equipment. Renting becomes more attractive.
Makes sense. Lower commitment.
Right. It also tends to rise when demand outstrips what manufacturers can produce, or during big equipment transitions, like, moving to new engine emission standards or eventually electrification. Those shifts encourage renting while things settle.
So the current environment uncertainty, maybe some lingering supply issues, these equipment changes that would suggest penetration is still rising.
Yes, exactly. The expectation for 2023, which they'll calculate fully early this year, is that penetration will likely get close to 55%.
Okay.
However, and this ties back to our earlier chat about specialty rental. The way that specialty equipment is being integrated into this specific 53.8% measure is still evolving. So that adds a bit of uncertainty about projecting this index way out into the future. It's not fully captured yet.
Interesting. It all Okay, how does Canada compare? Is their forecast similar to this U.S. outlook?
Actually, no. Canada's outlook for equipment rental is notably weaker than the U.S. forecast.
Really? Why the difference? Didn't they both have strong growth recently?
They did. Both economies saw really strong, even double-digit growth back in 2022. But Canada seems to be facing many of the same economic headwinds as the U.S., just maybe hitting harder in areas crucial for rental.
Like what? What are the main drivers of that weaker outlook up north?
The source points to a few things. Canada had a much more significant housing correction, whereas the U.S. market, while slow, is still fundamentally tight.
Okay, so housing's a bigger drag there.
Seems so. Also, their manufacturing sector is weighted differently, more towards slower-growing industries. That's actually leading to a forecast of slightly negative growth, specifically for general tool rental in Canada.
Negative growth. Wow. What about things like infrastructure spending? We hear so much about the big U.S. programs.
And that's another key difference. Canadian non-residential construction, while stable, it just doesn't have the same massive tailwind from federal funding like the U.S. does with the Infrastructure Act, the GHGS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are huge programs here.
Right, those aren't boosting Canada's construction sector in the same way.
Exactly. Also, commodity prices, while expected to be stable, play a bigger role in Canada's economy overall, especially oil prices for capital spending in places like Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador. That stability is maybe a bit more precarious.
So different economic makeup, different government policies, different exposure to global factors adds up to a weaker picture for rental in Canada.
That seems to be the conclusion, yes.
Yeah.
And there are geographic differences within Canada, too. The central provinces look weakest, with a bit better outlook in the eastern provinces and BC.
Just shows how localized economies can be, even within one country.
Mm-hmm.
And just to wrap up on the source itself, all this incredibly detailed data, the analysis, where does it actually originate?
So the specific data and analysis we've been digging into. It comes from a service called ARA Rentalytics.
ARA Rentalytics.
Yeah, it's an annual paid subscription service for members of the American Rental Association.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a general economic report. It's really tailored for people in the rental industry.
Right. It gives ARA members access to these detailed forecasts from S&P, but also things like forecasts for purchasing specific product groups, helps them plan their fleets, plus consumer surveys and even state-level digests. So a local rental company can see how their specific state fits into the bigger picture.
Very comprehensive. Okay, well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground. We dug into that 7.1% growth forecast, the record revenue expected for 2024.
Explore those really interesting historical adjustments, the construction data revisions, the whole expanding world of specialty rental.
Right, and analyze the key factors for 24 interest rates, the shifts in housing and renovation, manufacturing's role.
We also clarified that growth recession idea, talked about inflation being the main risk.
Looked at rental penetration trending up, and highlighted those significant differences between the U.S. and Canadian forecasts.
Yeah, quite a bit.
So what does this deep dive into one specific industry, equipment rental, what does it really mean for you listening right now?
Well, I think looking closely at these kinds of detailed forecasts and understanding the forces behind them, it gives you a really powerful lens on the bigger economic trends you might be noticing anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It shows how something like a decision by the central bank on interest rates eventually filters down to affect, how much construction is happening or even what kind of tools people are renting.
Yeah, it connects the dots, right, between those big government spending programs or shifts in global supply chains and what's actually happening on a building site down your street.
Or how businesses in different parts of the country are making decisions, buy this machine or rent it. It shows a macroeconomy isn't just abstract numbers. It's the sum of all these millions of specific decisions happening every day.
Exactly. So maybe a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. When you see construction, when you hear about interest rates or the housing market, think about this. Mm-hmm. How do these very specific industry details we talked about, like the type of home renovation changing or the different economic paths of the U.S. and Canada right now, how might those reflect deeper shifts in how we're behaving as consumers, shifts in government policy, global forces that might be impacting other parts of the economy and maybe your own life in ways you haven't quite connected yet?